A flight attendant tied a black teen down with oxygen masks and mocked him mid-flight. 1 minute later, the CEO wrapped that same hose around the attendant's neck until he collapsed. What happens next will leave you speechless. He bound a child with an oxygen mask, mocking him as if it was a joke. Subscribe if you believe no uniform is above the law. The whimper of an infant cut sharply through the dim hush of Kreslin Airways Flight 612. It was barely audible above the low hum of the engines, but it sliced the silence like a pin through cloth. In seat 11C, Adrian Kessler adjusted his grip on his baby son, Jonah, cradling the child's fragile frame against his broad chest. His hands, steady from years in high-stakes boardrooms, trembled ever so slightly now. The soft overhead lights painted his sharp jawline in streaks of silver and shadow, casting faint halos across the wool of his suit jacket. Across the aisle, a man with thin lips and too tight posture paused in his stride. Mason Drexler, lead flight attendant for the red-eye route to Helvern City, turned his head slowly, his gaze fixing on the source of the sound. Jonah let out another weak cry, just a breath louder than before. Mason's face remained neutral, but his fingers twitched at his side, clenching, then releasing. His reputation for discipline was well known among the crew, but it was the unspoken things, his mocking glances, his growing disdain for passengers who wore their wealth like armor, that made him feared behind closed galleys. Adrian didn't notice the look. His focus was split, one part devoted to calming Jonah, the other racing through a mental checklist of his upcoming presentation. The board meeting in Helvran was not just important, it was critical. Dominion Systems, his company, had been hanging by threads after a hostile takeover attempt 6 months earlier. This presentation would determine whether he retained control of the tech empire he built from nothing or watched it crumble under the weight of shareholder doubt. And yet, here he was, not rehearsing talking points, but gently humming to a restless baby. "Do you need assistance, sir?" Mason's voice was smooth but taut, like piano wire stretched too far. Adrian glanced up. "No, thank you. He just needs a moment." Mason's eyes swept the cabin as if confirming whether anyone else shared his irritation. 2 rows behind, a young man in headphones looked up briefly, then away. An older businessman beside him frowned but said nothing. The tension in the air was growing, not loud or angry but dense and expectant, as if the cabin itself was holding its breath. "I'm sure the other passengers would appreciate a bit of quiet," Mason said, the corners of his mouth not quite forming a smile. Adrian blinked, surprised by the comment. "I'm doing my best," he replied calmly, patting Jonah's back. The child squirmed but did not cry again. Mason lingered for a moment, then turned on his heel and walked down the aisle, his stride brisk, almost military. Adrian watched him go, unease crawling along his spine. Something about the man's tone. It wasn't professional annoyance. It was personal. Adrian had negotiated mergers worth billions, navigated hostile boardrooms filled with sharks in suits. He recognized veiled hostility when he heard it. Across the aisle, a thin man with glasses, a quiet tech contractor from the look of him, leaned forward slightly in his seat. His eyes flicked from Mason to Adrian, then back again. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. He had seen it too. Jonah shifted in Adrian's arms, his soft cheek brushing against his father's chest. The child was barely 9 months old, and this was his first flight. Adrian had debated whether to bring him, but with his wife overseas caring for her ailing father, he had no choice. Besides, the board had insisted on an in-person presentation, no exceptions. The cabin lights dimmed further as the plane climbed to cruising altitude. Adrian adjusted the baby's blanket, tucking the corners securely under Jonah's legs. The child's tiny hand grasped weakly at Adrian's finger, clinging without thought. That touch reminded him of everything at stake. This wasn't just a company he was fighting for anymore. It was a future, a legacy. Somewhere behind him, a tray clinked loudly. Mason's voice could be heard again, faint but clipped. "Let's keep the cabin orderly," he said to a colleague. "Some people think the rules don't apply to them once they hit a certain income bracket." Adrian heard the words. He said nothing, but his grip on Jonah tightened. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to focus on the rhythm of his son's breathing. In, out, in, out. But Mason's presence loomed. The way he hovered, circled like a hawk watching a mouse, made Adrian's skin prickle with anticipation. The man wasn't just irritated, he was building toward something. From the galley, Mason emerged again, pushing a cart down the aisle with deliberate speed. His eyes flicked toward 11C, and his mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something colder. As he passed Adrian, he stopped again. "Sir, if your child cannot remain quiet, we may need to find another solution," Mason said, louder this time. Adrian looked up, his voice even. "He's a baby. He's not misbehaving." Mason leaned in, his tone sharpening. "Other passengers have paid for a comfortable flight. Your child is making that difficult. Then offer them headphones," Adrian replied calmly, though a flicker of anger stirred in his chest. Mason stood still for a beat, then gave a tight nod and continued forward, disappearing toward the front of the plane. But Adrian knew he would be back. He could feel it. He glanced around again. Some passengers avoided eye contact. Others looked confused. No one spoke up. Jonah stirred again, a soft, helpless sound escaping his lips. Adrian pressed his cheek gently against the baby's forehead and whispered, "It's okay. I've got you." The lights above flickered slightly as turbulence began, subtle but growing. Adrian closed his eyes, whispering quiet comforts to his child, unaware of the storm forming beyond the cockpit or the one brewing just across the aisle. In the cabin's dim light, the air grew heavy with a storm unseen. Without warning, Mason Drexler reached for the oxygen mask clipped to the panel just above Adrian's seat. His movements were smooth, practiced, almost rehearsed, as he unhooked the device and tugged it free from its cradle. His face wore a calculated calm, but there was something else beneath the surface, an eagerness, a flicker of spite in his eyes as he looked at the restless baby in Adrian's arms. "This might help," Mason said, his voice sugar-coated, falsely pleasant. Adrian blinked, confused for a moment, adjusting Jonah in his lap. "He doesn't need oxygen," he said quietly, still trying to soothe the infant's soft cries with a gentle sway of his arm. But Mason didn't stop. "Sometimes pressure calms them." "It's perfectly safe," he added, already looping the dangling straps of the mask around Jonah's tiny wrists instead of his face. Adrian's heart skipped. "Wait, what are you—" Before he could finish, Mason tightened the straps, snapping the loops snugly against Jonah's skin. The baby jerked, his tiny body recoiling from the foreign restraint. His soft coos of distress turned into full cries, sharp, high-pitched, panicked. Mason didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping into a whisper meant only for Adrian's ears. "This will teach him to be quiet." Adrian's body tensed. "Get your hands off my son," he growled, reaching to unfasten the straps. Mason's hand shot out, blocking him with firm pressure on his chest. The flight attendant's smile twisted cruelly. Adrian tried to push forward, but Mason moved first, his fist flashing in a tight arc that caught Adrian squarely in the jaw. The pain was blinding. Adrian reeled back into his seat, the taste of blood spreading across his tongue. A low murmur surged through the cabin like a wave, passengers snapping out of their stupor. One man, 2 rows back, lifted his phone quietly, the lens already recording, his hands trembling. Another turned to his neighbor with wide eyes, whispering urgently. No one moved to intervene yet. Adrian's mind throbbed with the pounding in his jaw, but his focus was on Jonah. The infant screamed louder now, his face red, his arms struggling against the tight alien bonds of the oxygen mask straps. The fabric left angry impressions on his delicate skin. He lunged again, this time using both hands to tear at the straps, but Mason pressed down harder, keeping him pinned. "Sir, please remain seated," he barked loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "You're causing a disturbance." Adrian's pulse roared in his ears. Mason was using procedure as a weapon. The uniform, the false authority, the public performance, all of it was a shield. But Adrian saw through it. He saw the hate behind Mason's eyes, not just toward Jonah, but toward everything Adrian represented. Wealth, control, power. Jonah's cries became choked, the panic in his small body overtaking his voice. Adrian's panic shifted into something colder, strategy. He studied Mason's stance, the arrogance in his posture, the smug control in his expression. He wasn't afraid. He thought no one would stop him. He thought no one could. Adrian clenched the armrest, slowly wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. The coppery scent filled his nose. Mason turned slightly, checking if anyone from the rear cabin was approaching. The other attendants stood frozen near the galley, whispering amongst themselves, unsure whether to support their colleague or stay out of what had clearly become something volatile. Adrian's eyes darted to the oxygen tubing still dangling from the ceiling, the same one Mason had used so carelessly. He filed that image away, not yet ready to act, but preparing. Every part of him ached to strike back, but his corporate instincts forced him to wait. One wrong move, and Mason would have an excuse to paint Adrian as the aggressor. Number? Not yet. Not until it mattered. Passengers nearby were no longer just watching, they were calculating. Adrian caught the eye of a man across the aisle who looked like he wanted to speak, but he turned his gaze quickly to the floor. A young boy peeked over the seat in front, his eyes wide with confusion, before his father gently pulled him back. Mason stepped away momentarily, adjusting his vest like nothing had happened. "Just trying to help," he said, addressing the nearby passengers, masking his hostility behind a thin veil of customer service. "Some people just don't understand flight safety." Adrian breathed in slowly, cradling Jonah closer. His heart hammered, not just from rage, but from the helplessness of seeing his son in distress. He had faced billion-dollar negotiations, government inquiries, hostile boardrooms, but nothing compared to the raw helplessness of this moment. Jonah's cries now cracked at the edges, exhausted, hoarse. Adrian placed a protective hand behind his son's head, whispering gently, "Daddy's here. Daddy's got you." He could feel the red marks on Jonah's wrist through the fabric of his onesie, could feel the tremble in his breath. A lump formed in Adrian's throat, but he swallowed it down. Across the aisle, a teenager raised his phone a little higher, mouthing something to his father. "Record this." The air in the cabin thickened. The hum of the engines remained steady, a cold contrast to the rising fury in Adrian's chest. Mason was still smirking as he turned his back, believing himself untouchable. Adrian's fingers brushed the tubing again. He didn't need to act yet, but when the time came, he wouldn't hesitate. Because this man, this uniformed monster, had made one fatal mistake. He didn't just assault a passenger, he assaulted a father's world. The baby's cries turned from soft whimpers to piercing wails, echoing through the cabin like a siren for justice. Adrian wiped the blood from his split lip, tasting iron and fury. The sting barely registered. His mind, trained through years of boardroom battles and hostile takeovers, shifted instantly into survival mode, not just for him, but for his son. Jonah's cries were softer now, weaker. That terrified him more than anything. Around him, the cabin of Flight 612 hung in stunned silence. Passengers sat rigid, eyes darting between Adrian and Mason, unsure whether they were watching a bizarre in-flight performance or the opening act of something far darker. Some held phones loosely, half raised as if paralyzed by indecision. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade beneath the weight of the moment. Adrian's gaze scanned the rear of the plane where two younger male crew members stood frozen, whispering urgently but doing nothing. One of them, a blond man with trembling hands, gripped the back of a seat as if it might anchor him against the storm unraveling in front of him. But they were spectators, not allies. Mason stood just 2 feet away, posture relaxed, lips curling into a smirk as if he'd just won some twisted game. The soft click of his shoes against the aisle floor as he adjusted his stance rang out with the arrogance of someone certain he'd never be challenged. Adrian could see it now. This wasn't about procedure or noise complaints. Mason enjoyed the power. He fed off the discomfort. Strapping Jonah down had been a display, not a decision. "Try that again," Mason sneered, voice low but laced with menace. "And next time, you'll both be restrained." Adrian didn't respond. His heart pounded like war drums in his chest, but his exterior remained composed. A lifetime of leading under pressure had taught him the value of silence, of calculation. Behind Mason, Jonah writhed slightly in the seat, his tiny arms still bound by the oxygen mask straps. His cries were fainter now, almost hoarse, and that sight pierced deeper than any wound Mason could have inflicted. His son, his only son, was bound, bruised, and helpless, and no one had lifted a finger. Adrian knew then that pleading was useless. Mason didn't want submission. He wanted a stage, and Adrian had given him one by waiting this long. His eyes dropped casually to the dangling length of oxygen tubing beside the seat. The loose coil shimmered faintly under the overhead cabin light, forgotten and unimportant to everyone but Adrian. His fingers reached for it, slow and steady, each movement deliberate so as not to draw Mason's attention. Inside, his mind spun with possibility. He couldn't outmatch Mason in brute force, at least not easily, not while still cradling Jonah with one arm, but he could outsmart him. That was what he did best. He'd outmaneuvered billion-dollar firms and boardroom tyrants. Mason was just another hostile actor, one who didn't yet know he was already outplayed. As Adrian's hand closed around the cool plastic tubing, Mason shifted slightly, glancing toward a row of passengers still whispering nervously. His mistake. Adrian moved. With the speed of a man acting on instinct rather than thought, he surged forward and looped the tubing around Mason's extended wrist, yanking it hard to pull him off balance. Mason stumbled, his confident mask cracking into a stunned grimace as he tried to wrench himself free. "What the?" he began, but the words were cut off as Adrian spun behind him in one fluid motion. Adrian's arm wrapped around Mason's neck, tightening the tubing across his throat. The flight attendant thrashed, clawing at the makeshift restraint, but Adrian's grip was anchored in fury and precision. His breathing was steady, his expression stone. "I warned you," Adrian growled into his ear, his voice calm, unwavering. "You thought this was control. It was cowardice." Passengers gasped again. Some stood, others merely watched, rooted by fear or fascination. Someone whispered, "He's got him," while another man in a business suit pulled out his phone and began filming. Adrian kept one arm locked around Mason, the other bracing Jonah against his side. The child whimpered faintly, his strength nearly gone. The red marks on Jonah's wrists burned into Adrian's memory like firebrands. "I'm getting security," one of the younger attendants shouted, finally jolting into motion, but he didn't move. "You feel that?" Adrian asked Mason, tightening the tube a notch. "That's what you gave him." "That's what you thought was funny," Mason gasped, his face turning a blotchy red, arms flailing in tight arcs. He thrashed wildly for leverage, but the narrow aisle gave him none. Adrian held firm. "Let him go," someone yelled, not at Adrian but at Mason, as if the crowd had finally chosen a side. Tension cracked like electricity in the air. Jonah gave a faint cry as Adrian gently shifted, using one hand to slide his fingers under the oxygen mask straps still biting into the baby's arms. He loosened them carefully, methodically, even as his other hand kept the tubing taut around Mason's neck. Mason's strength began to ebb. His movements slowed, panicked breaths turning to wheezing gasps. Adrian leaned in one last time. "Remember this," he whispered, "because it's the moment everything turned." He loosened the tube just enough to let Mason collapse backward into the aisle, wheezing and coughing, his face wet with sweat. The smirk was gone, replaced by something far more satisfying: fear. Adrian knelt beside Jonah, unfastening the final strap and pulling his son close. The child buried his face into Adrian's chest, tears soaking into his father's shirt. Adrian turned to face the passengers, his jaw set. No one spoke, no one moved, but something had shifted. An unspoken agreement passed silently from row to row. The predator had become the prey. In the heart of the cabin, silence sharpened into resolve. With a sudden surge of motion, Adrian grabbed the dangling oxygen tube and yanked it hard, the plastic line snapping taut with a sharp hiss. Mason's body jerked forward as the tubing coiled around his wrist, dragging him off balance toward the seat. His smirk vanished in an instant, replaced by a wide-eyed expression of disbelief. The smugness that had clung to his face like armor cracked under the weight of surprise. His free hand shot forward to push Adrian back, but the CEO had already risen halfway from his seat, anchored by the weight of fury and love. Gasps erupted from the rows behind them. The nearest passengers jolted, hands half raised to intervene or flee, but none moved. The cabin seemed to tighten with suspense, the fluorescent lighting flickering faintly as if sensing the shift in dominance. Adrian's grip was unyielding as he yanked Mason's arm down and spun the remaining length of tubing upward in a clean arc. In one practiced motion, more instinct than skill, he looped it around the man's throat and pulled back. Mason's breath hitched, a choked wheeze tearing from his throat. His hands scrambled against the tubing, fingers clawing at the cord now digging into his neck. His eyes bulged with panic, lips parting to speak, but no words emerged, only the wet rasp of constricted lungs. Adrian leaned in, his voice low and steady as stone. "Feel what you gave my son." The surrounding air seemed to freeze. The only sound was Jonah's weakened whimper, muffled under the noise of the struggle. One of his small hands twitched against the tightly bound strap. Adrian's eyes darted to the oxygen mask buckled around his baby's wrist. Too tight, digging into the soft skin, and a wave of protective rage surged through him. Still keeping Mason off balance with the tubing, Adrian used his other hand to fumble at the buckle securing Jonah to the seat. The strap resisted, twisted tight, and his fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the chaos surging in his chest. Mason tried to twist away, groaning through clenched teeth, but Adrian responded by shifting his weight, locking his legs to trap the attendant against the armrest. "Stop!" Mason gasped hoarsely, the tubing digging deeper. But Adrian didn't stop. He didn't shout. His silence screamed louder than any yell. The calm on his face was terrifying, controlled fury honed from years of boardroom battles and strategic takedowns. But this wasn't business. This was survival. This was fatherhood made sharp and immediate. "Let go of him," a voice shouted from behind, but it wasn't clear whether it was directed at Mason or Adrian. The buckle clicked loose. Jonah's tiny arms fell free, and he slumped forward with a tired, rattling breath. Adrian scooped him up in a single fluid motion, cradling his son against his chest with one arm while the other kept the tubing taut. Mason's knees buckled. He was no longer struggling to escape, but merely trying to remain conscious. His face turned a blotchy red, sweat beading at his temple. His limbs jerked weakly like a marionette with severed strings. The roles had reversed in full. The flight attendant, once towering over a restrained child, was now himself at the mercy of a man who had nothing left to lose. Adrian stared down at him, breathing hard through the pain in his lip, blood dripping onto Jonah's blanket. It looked almost ceremonial, a stain that marked the moment everything changed. The baby didn't cry anymore. He simply looked up at his father with wide, glassy eyes. Around them, the passengers had moved from gasping to murmuring. Some whispered words of support. Others simply watched in stunned silence, caught in the gravity of the confrontation. No one dared stop Adrian now. No one reached for Mason. He loosened his grip slightly, not to show mercy, but to deliver his final words before the man collapsed entirely. Adrian leaned in close, his breath hot against Mason's ear. "You thought silence meant safety," he whispered, each word deliberate. "It only meant waiting." Mason's eyes rolled back as his legs finally gave way. He crumpled to the floor of the aisle, limbs folding beneath him, the tubing trailing loosely from Adrian's hand. The red welts around his throat glared like proof. He coughed violently, the sound brittle and pathetic. No crew member rushed to help. No authority stepped in. Adrian dropped into the seat beside his son, his chest heaving, his arm coiled tightly around Jonah's trembling frame. He didn't look at Mason again. His gaze remained forward, jaw clenched, eyes burning with the cold fire of a man who'd crossed a line he never intended to, but had no regrets for doing so. Somewhere in the cabin, a man's voice broke the silence. He did what any father would do. The cabin remained hushed. Somewhere, someone recorded. Somewhere, someone simply stared. But no one spoke against Adrian now. The storm had struck. The balance had shifted. The predator now lay gasping on the floor, and in Adrian's arms, a child breathed free again. For every action, there comes a moment of equal reckoning. Mason stumbled backward as the tubing tightened around his neck, his eyes bulging in disbelief. The smug certainty that had earlier curled on his lips vanished like smoke under pressure. His hands clawed at the plastic, fingers trembling as they scrambled for relief. But Adrian Kessler held firm. One hand anchored the line around Mason's throat, the other pressed Jonah protectively against his chest. His grip wasn't fueled by panic. It was forged in the furnace of cold, controlled fury. The cabin around them swirled into chaos, yet no one moved. Passengers remained glued to their seats, some frozen in disbelief, others with phones discreetly raised, capturing the unfolding reckoning. Murmurs filled the air, soft gasps and stifled pleas mixing with the low hum of the aircraft's engines. A man in the aisle seat muttered, "He had it coming," too quiet for anyone but himself to hear. Another clutched his armrest, eyes darting between the struggling flight attendant and the resolute father. Mason's face shifted rapidly between rage and fear. His mouth opened to shout, but the constriction around his neck stole the air before the words could form. He reached forward with a trembling hand, trying to push Adrian off, but Adrian didn't flinch. He leaned in, close enough for Mason to feel his breath. His voice was a low growl, steady and deliberate. "You thought silence meant safety," Adrian whispered, his tone laced with a chilling calmness. "It only meant waiting." The words cut deeper than the tubing. Mason's eyes widened, Not just from the lack of air, but from recognition. This wasn't a man who had lost control. This was a man who had seized it. Jonah stirred weakly in Adrian's arm, his tiny fingers curling against his father's shirt. His cries, once sharp with fear, had faded into strained whimpers, drained, not soothed. The child's exhaustion painted urgency across Adrian's resolve. He couldn't let this go on any longer. This wasn't vengeance, it was necessity. Mason's knees began to tremble, wobbling like a poorly fastened beam about to give way. His balance faltered. He tried again to pull away, but his limbs betrayed him. The illusion of dominance, the power he had so confidently wielded minutes earlier, drained from him with every constricted breath. His legs finally gave out, buckling beneath him as he collapsed against the edge of the aisle. Adrian didn't let go immediately. He eased the tubing slowly, his movements precise, never rushed. Mason's body slumped to the floor, one hand landing limp beside the food cart, the other falling across his own chest. The welts left by the oxygen tube wrapped around his throat like a collar of consequence. Vivid, undeniable, red. Adrian knelt beside him, steadying Jonah with one arm. He stared at Mason, who now lay sprawled and gasping like a broken marionette, stripped of command. The other passengers continued whispering, a ripple of tension hanging in the stale cabin air. No one applauded. No one spoke. But the shift in atmosphere was tangible. What had been a room of silent observers was now a chamber of reluctant witnesses. From the corner, a younger man with a trembling phone whispered to someone beside him, "He didn't just fight back." He made a statement. Adrian didn't respond to the voices. His focus remained on the attendant at his feet and the child in his arms. Jonah's eyes fluttered open, half-lidded with exhaustion, his breath hitching softly. Adrian brushed his fingers across his son's forehead, checking his skin, his breathing. The red lines around Jonah's wrists were still visible, tiny, raw reminders of what had nearly been lost. The weight of it all pressed down on Adrian. His jaw clenched. He had spent years fighting boardrooms, stockholders, and hostile acquisitions, but nothing in his life had ever demanded this level of instinct, this level of primal clarity. There was no negotiation here, no balance sheet, only a father, a child, and a man who had crossed a line. Behind them, someone finally summoned the courage to speak. "Is he breathing?" asked a voice from the aisle. Adrian didn't look back. "He's breathing. That's more than he gave my son." He stood slowly, the strain in his muscles undeniable now. His breath was still heavy but measured. Every nerve in his body buzzed with adrenaline, yet his mind remained clear. Jonah's faint weight on his shoulder was both anchor and motivation. He wasn't done yet. This wasn't finished. What happened here had roots far deeper than Mason's arrogance. Somewhere behind that uniform was a system that had allowed it to thrive. Adrian looked down one last time at the slumped figure below him, choking, not on plastic tubing now, but on the consequences of his own actions. Mason's eyes fluttered open, his vision blurry, his mouth barely able to move. Adrian said nothing more. He didn't need to. A single drop of blood from Adrian's earlier split lip fell onto Jonah's blanket, red against white. It landed softly, but its symbolism was deafening. He turned back toward his seat, sat down slowly, and cradled Jonah close, drawing the boy's small head to his chest. The child's breath synced with his own, shaky but steady. Around them, the aircraft remained in a stunned hush, and in that silence, something new settled in the air. Not just vengeance, but purpose. Adrian's thoughts moved beyond this moment, already plotting. If Mason was the symptom, he would find the disease. He would expose it. He would dismantle it. He would make sure no child, no parent, ever faced this again. And as the jet continued its course through the dark sky, heading toward an unplanned landing, Adrian sat upright, eyes burning with clarity. In that moment, Adrian understood. This wasn't just about defending Jonah. It was about exposing the system that allowed a man like Mason to wield power unchecked. Justice, once awakened, never returns to sleep. Mason Drexler collapsed against the narrow aisle floor, wheezing and clawing weakly at the oxygen tubing still loose around his neck. His once proud uniform now clung to him like a costume stripped of power, his face flushed, his breaths shallow. Around him, passengers remained frozen, caught between disbelief and relief, unsure whether to speak, move, or applaud. Adrian Kessler didn't move right away. He remained seated, his body trembling with adrenaline as he clutched Jonah tightly to his chest. The baby's sobs had softened, but the warmth of his small body still pulsed with fear. Adrian could feel the boy's heart fluttering against his own, rapid, erratic, a mirror of his own inner storm. He pressed a steadying hand to Jonah's back, and with the other gently touched the red marks still etched into the child's wrists, left behind by the cruelly tightened oxygen straps. The plane was quiet except for the low hum of the engines and Mason's desperate, broken gasps for air. In the back, a steward with shaking hands reached for the cabin phone but stopped when he caught the eyes of several passengers now standing halfway in the aisle, their phones raised, silent witnesses with lenses recording everything. The first to break the silence was a voice, measured but firm. "I have this all recorded," said a passenger from halfway down the cabin. He stepped forward with hesitant confidence, holding his phone up like a badge. He was a slight man in his early 30s, wearing thick glasses and a cardigan that looked 2 sizes too big. "If they try to cover it up, the truth will still get out." Adrian looked up, locking eyes with the man. There was no need for words, just a slow, heavy nod. Gratitude passed silently between them. He didn't know the man's name, not yet, but in that moment he became an ally in a war Adrian hadn't expected to fight tonight. The quiet in the cabin didn't last. From the galley at the rear, 3 crew members huddled together, whispering in low, anxious voices. One of them, a lanky man with thinning hair and a badge that read Terrence, glanced repeatedly at Mason's crumpled figure, then at Adrian, then at the growing crowd of passengers whispering among themselves. He shifted from one foot to the other, sweat beading on his temple. Another attendant, a younger man with freckles and a nervous stammer, murmured, Should we report this in?" "Like, officially?" Terrence shook his head. "Not yet. Let's wait for the captain." But Adrian wasn't waiting. His eyes scanned the cabin. He could already feel the storm brewing beyond this moment, the kind that wore ties and boardroom smiles, the kind that called themselves public relations and risk managers, and he knew instinctively that what had just happened wouldn't be written down honestly in Kreslin Airways incident report. He turned slightly and reached into the seat pocket, pulling out a napkin. Carefully, he began dabbing at the dried blood along his jaw. The pain was sharp now that the heat of confrontation had faded, but he welcomed it. It grounded him. Across from him, Mason groaned, his eyes darting toward Adrian with a mixture of hate and humiliation. "You did this to yourself," Adrian muttered under his breath, voice low and steady. Jonah stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Adrian shifted him gently, adjusting the blanket back over his legs, then kissed the top of his head. His child's breathing was uneven, his skin still blotchy from crying. The image carved itself into Adrian's memory like a brand, his son, bound and helpless, humiliated by a stranger. This flight had begun with the goal of closing a corporate deal. Now, the only thing Adrian wanted to close was the door on people like Mason ever holding power again. More passengers were speaking now, their voices overlapping in a chorus of disbelief and concern. "I saw everything," one said. "I've got it on my phone, too." "That guy needs to be fired, arrested, even, poor baby," murmured another, peering sympathetically at Jonah. In the midst of it all, the captain's voice finally crackled through the intercom. It was calm, but there was a tremble beneath the words, as if he too sensed that something irreversible had happened. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to a medical issue, we'll be diverting and making an unscheduled landing at Hereford Airfield. Please remain seated and calm. Medical personnel will be standing by upon arrival. Thank you for your cooperation." There was no mention of what had truly happened. No apology. No name. Just a sterile phrase. Medical issue. Adrian let out a bitter laugh under his breath. "Of course." He looked over to the man who had first spoken, now seated again in the aisle seat. "Name's Adrian," he said quietly. "Victor," the man replied. "Victor Hall. I'm an accountant. Don't usually say much, but this was too much." Adrian gave him a tight nod. "Thanks for speaking up." "I won't forget it." Victor smiled faintly and tapped his phone. "Neither will the internet." Yet even as the passengers whispered and the crew flinched, Adrian's thoughts began shifting ahead. If Kreslin tried to cover this up, and he was certain they would, it would take more than one video and a few witnesses to fight back. He was a man who built empires on strategy. Tonight, the empire he'd fight against was one built on silence, policy loopholes, and faceless immunity. He shifted in his seat again, pulling Jonah closer. His son had fallen into a shallow sleep, but the bruises on his wrists remained vivid. Adrian traced them gently with his thumb, memorizing them, not out of guilt, but as a promise. The promise of retribution. The promise that tonight's horror would not vanish into polite headlines or buried incident reports. The promise that what began on this flight would echo far beyond it. The promise that no father, no child would suffer the same again. The battle for safety had only just begun. The captain's voice broke over the intercom like a crack in glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an unscheduled landing due to a medical issue in the forward cabin. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." The announcement was clinical, practiced, but Adrian caught the hesitation beneath the calm tone, the kind of pause that betrayed worry. A low murmur swept through the cabin, like the rustle of dry leaves before a storm. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering theories and questions. Some leaned into the aisle, eyes flicking toward the front where Mason Drexler now lay sprawled near the emergency row, wheezing and red-faced, one hand weakly clutching his throat. Adrian sat motionless for a moment, Jonah cradled tightly in his arms. The baby's breathing had slowed, but his skin remained flushed, his eyelids heavy with exhaustion. The angry red marks around his wrists from the oxygen mask straps were vivid against his delicate skin. Adrian's jaw clenched at the sight. He could still taste iron from the split in his lip, still feel the weight of Mason's punch, but those pains were distant now, overshadowed by the image of his son being restrained like baggage. Mason groaned and tried to sit up. His limbs trembled beneath him, and his eyes, bloodshot and unfocused, darted toward Adrian with a mixture of disbelief and fear. Gone was the smirk, the swagger. What remained was a man exposed, stripped of the power he once abused. Adrian didn't flinch. Across the aisle, a young man in a gray hoodie leaned over to another passenger, whispering, "They're going to cover this up. Watch." The other nodded grimly. A man in a business suit, seated 2 rows behind, raised his phone discreetly and began recording again. "Sir," a voice called softly. Adrian turned his head. It was the same man from earlier, the one who had stood up when no one else dared. "You need to sue." "People saw it. We saw it. That man assaulted your child." Adrian met the stranger's eyes, reading the sincerity there. But beneath that encouragement was also a warning, a quiet recognition that justice wasn't guaranteed, even when the truth was visible. Adrian nodded once, silently thanking him, then turned his focus back to Jonah. The boy stirred, his little fingers curling against his father's collar as he whimpered, barely awake. Adrian gently rocked him, pressing his lips to the child's forehead, as if trying to imprint reassurance directly into the skin. But the bruises on Jonah's arms made that comfort feel hollow. Some passengers were now speaking more openly. "Can you believe they let that guy do that?" one man muttered. "I heard him say, 'This will teach him to be quiet.' That's not stress, that's sick." Adrian overheard every word. He could feel the weight of their outrage, but also their uncertainty. No one knew what would happen next, whether this incident would make headlines or disappear in the endless churn of silence and spin. From the rear galley, 2 of the other male attendants peeked into the cabin. Their faces were pale, uncertain. One of them, a sandy-haired steward who had remained quiet the whole flight, whispered something to his colleague and disappeared back behind the curtain. No one came forward to check on Mason. No one offered Adrian help. The crew had gone mute. The engines hummed steadily beneath them, a sound so normal it felt almost surreal given what had just happened. Adrian's mind turned sharply toward what was coming. The plane would land, officials would board, and somewhere, someone would start rewriting this story before it was even finished. He could already hear the excuses forming. Passenger altercation, misunderstanding, stress response, the hollow words companies use to dull the sharp edges of truth. His phone vibrated faintly in his pocket. He slid it out carefully without disturbing Jonah and saw a single message light up the screen. It was from an unknown number, airdropped from someone else on board. "Save the footage? They'll try to delete it." Attached was a clip, only a few seconds long, but it showed everything. Mason walking toward Jonah with the oxygen mask, the cruel tightening of the straps, and the punch that followed. Adrian's hands shook as he downloaded it and locked it behind a secure folder. Someone out there knew how these stories vanished. Jonah whimpered again and clutched a fistful of Adrian's shirt. Adrian whispered, "We'll be all right." I promise you." His voice cracked softly under the weight of the words. He wasn't sure if it was a promise or a prayer. As the landing gear groaned to life beneath the cabin and the city lights of Hereford blinked through the clouds, Adrian stared out the window, jaw tight. He didn't know yet who waited on the tarmac. But one thing was certain. This was far from over. Promises made in blood weigh heavier than any spoken in peace. He told the baby he deserved it. Certain fear would bury the truth. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. The wheels screeched against the runway as Flight 612 made its rough emergency landing at Hereford Airfield. The jolt shook the cabin, waking those who had tried to retreat into uneasy silence. Before the plane even came to a full stop, the metallic hiss of the doors opening filled the air, followed by the urgent clatter of boots on the jetway. Paramedics rushed aboard, pushing a stretcher with professional haste, followed closely by airport security in dark uniforms. Mason Drexler was still on the floor of the aisle, groaning faintly, a hand to his reddened neck. His shirt was torn, the tubing marks deep against his pale skin. The lead paramedic, a man with graying temples and a calm but firm tone, leaned down to examine him. "What happened here?" he asked aloud, though his attention stayed focused on Mason's vital signs. Before anyone could answer, one of the flight attendants, Greg Turner, a younger man with trembling hands, stepped forward and whispered something into the nearest officer's ear. His voice was low but deliberate, the words reaching Adrian's ears like venom laced in silk. "Unprovoked assault. Passenger went violent. The baby's fine, but the crew member's neck, he couldn't breathe." Adrian stood in the aisle, cradling Jonah close to his chest. The baby had calmed into a shallow sleep, his face pressed against Adrian's collar, but the father's body pulsed with rage. His jaw was tight, his temple bruised and swelling from Mason's earlier blow. He took a breath, stepped forward, and raised his voice, clear and strong. "That man," Adrian said, pointing directly at Mason, "tied my baby down with an oxygen mask, wrapped it around his wrists, and then punched me in the face when I tried to stop him." His voice echoed through the stunned silence. Some passengers flinched, others nodded subtly. Adrian's eyes scanned the crowd. "Check the passengers' recordings if you dare," he continued louder now. "Don't you dare let them spin this into something it's not." Dozens of phones rose in reply like a chorus of truth. Multiple passengers, including the accountant who had spoken up earlier, Victor Hall, held up their screens with footage already cued. One man, older and nervous, pressed play and let the muffled sound of Jonah's cries and Mason's harsh voice fill the air. The paramedics paused. The officers turned. But even as evidence bloomed into the open, two men in pressed navy blazers pushed past the line of medics and security. Airline representatives, clean-shaven, expressionless, and rehearsed. One of them, with a name tag that read Neil Carson, Passenger Affairs, stepped forward with a practiced air of concern. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding," Neil said smoothly, his voice low but audible. "We ask that everyone remain calm as we determine exactly what transpired." "This appears to be a case of inflamed tensions and high stress." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare call this a misunderstanding," he said. "I watched that man assault my child." He should be in cuffs, but the paramedics lifted Mason onto the stretcher, gently guiding him as if he were the one in need of protection. No handcuffs, no formal questioning, just a slow, padded exit down the aisle. Adrian stepped aside but never took his eyes off them. Jonah stirred against his shoulder, and Adrian kissed his son's hair. Behind him, whispers stirred like dry leaves in wind. "They're covering for the flight crew. I saw it happen. Why isn't anyone stopping them? We should post our videos before they take them down." Adrian turned to face the cabin. The passengers weren't hostile, they were confused. Nervous, many held the truth in their hands but didn't know what to do with it. He couldn't blame them. The weight of going against a corporation was heavier than most imagined. He moved toward the exit as security gestured for him to follow. "You'll be asked to give a statement, sir," one officer muttered without looking him in the eye. "Please come with us." Adrian nodded, holding Jonah tightly, but his mind was already calculating. They were framing the narrative, twisting it, and if he let them, the truth would vanish beneath paperwork and PR statements. As they walked down the jet bridge, a younger security officer leaned closer to an older one and whispered, "You think we'll get in trouble if we contradict the airline?" That whisper told Adrian everything he needed to know. In the sterile light of the terminal, Adrian was met by more airline officials, this time in suits instead of uniforms. They wore polished shoes, gold pins, and faces that had rehearsed concern in front of mirrors. One of them offered a tissue, gesturing to the dried blood on Adrian's lip. Another tried to coo gently at Jonah, who whimpered in his father's arms. "We're here to assist in any way we can," one said, as another ushered them toward a private room. But Adrian stopped walking. He turned to face the nearest camera, one set up by a local news crew who had caught wind of the emergency landing. He didn't speak yet, but he made sure the red recording light was on. He raised his voice just enough to carry. This was no accident. It wasn't confusion. A flight attendant used a safety device to harm my baby, and now they're pretending he's the one who needs help. A few gasps echoed. Some airport staff froze in place. Neil Carson stepped in quickly, speaking through a smile. "We understand emotions are high, but this is a moment to seek clarity, not conflict." Adrian stared through him. "No, this is the moment you hope everyone forgets. I won't let that happen." More phones came out. A ripple was building, and Adrian knew, if he could keep it alive, he might have a chance to fight back. But even as hope flickered, a knot twisted in his gut. He didn't know yet how deep Cresslane's reach truly ran, but he was about to find out. In the battle between truth and power, silence was the weapon of choice. Adrian was escorted into a private room inside the terminal, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead like a warning he couldn't yet read. The sterile white walls and soundproofed stillness reminded him of negotiation chambers from corporate war rooms, rooms where decisions were made behind closed doors and truth was often the first casualty. Jonah stirred against his chest, his small body warm and drowsy, his breath shallow but steady. Adrian adjusted his grip, careful not to disturb the child's exhausted sleep, though the fading redness on the baby's wrists still burned in his memory. The door shut behind them with a dull click. Two men in dark suits were already waiting, one older with slicked-back gray hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, the other younger, clean-cut, his jaw clenched tight behind a practiced calm. They didn't rise. Their body language said everything. They were in control, or at least they believed they were. "Mr. Kessler," the older man said smoothly, rising finally with a rehearsed motion. "I'm Leonard Price, Senior Response Advisor for Crestline Airways." He gestured to his companion. "And this is Damon Hale, part of our internal legal and crisis division." Adrian didn't speak. He simply shifted Jonah into the crook of his left arm, letting the child's cheek rest against his shoulder. His right hand remained free, loose but ready. Leonard continued, his tone laced with faux empathy. "We regret what you experienced on Flight 612. It's a highly unfortunate situation. Rest assured, we're taking internal steps to assess the behavior of the involved crew member." Adrian raised an eyebrow, the cut on his lip pulling slightly. "You mean the man who tied down my infant son with an oxygen mask and punched me in the face?" Leonard hesitated, as if weighing whether to acknowledge or downplay the event. He went with the latter. "We understand emotions were running high. Flights can be stressful environments. That said, the company is prepared to offer you a generous resolution." Discreetly, of course, Damon Hale reached into his briefcase and slid a plain envelope across the table. His movements were mechanical, almost bored, like he'd done this dozens of times. The envelope stopped a few inches from Adrian's elbow. Adrian stared at it, but didn't touch it. "Is that what you think I came here for?" he asked quietly. "To be bought off with airline vouchers and a signed apology?" "It's more than that," Damon replied, his voice cooler, more transactional than Leonard's. "There's a financial figure involved, naturally, and non-disclosure paperwork. We simply want to resolve this without creating panic or unnecessary public drama. Think of it as protecting your privacy and your child's." At that, Adrian's eyes snapped toward Damon, the air thickening between them. The younger man flinched ever so slightly under the weight of Adrian's gaze, as if realizing he'd misjudged the tone. "You're protecting no one but yourselves," Adrian said, his voice low, each word deliberate. "You're worried about headlines, not harm." Leonard stepped in, his hands spread in a calming gesture. "Mr. Kessler, please understand. We're trying to find a path forward that prevents escalation. Public narratives can spiral, especially when media gets involved. There's no need for your son to become the face of some viral spectacle." "And yet," Adrian muttered, "your employee made him one." Silence ballooned in the room. Adrian looked down at Jonah, whose breath was slow, his little fingers curled into Adrian's suit lapel. The bruises on his wrists had faded just enough to make them almost ignorable, if you were the kind of man who wanted to forget. Adrian wasn't. He slowly stood, balancing Jonah on his arm like he'd done 100 times before, but this time it felt different, heavier, like he was carrying both a child and a cause. He reached across the table, not for the envelope, but to slide it gently back toward Damon. "I don't want your money," Adrian said. "I want accountability." Damon's eyes narrowed, the pretense of civility thinning. "You should know, Mr. Kessler, things get more complicated when lawyers get involved. Reputations get tested. People lose sight of reason." "Is that a threat?" Adrian asked sharply. "It's advice," Damon replied. "Take the offer. Walk away clean." Adrian leaned forward, just slightly. His voice dropped into a quiet steadiness that cut through the air like a blade. "I've spent 20 years navigating billion-dollar negotiations, surviving hostile takeovers, and dismantling corporate lies with nothing but proof and precision. You think I'm going to be afraid of a press release?" Leonard's jaw tensed. The power dynamic had shifted, and they knew it. Jonah whimpered faintly in his sleep, his head turning slightly. Adrian's stance softened only for his son, brushing his fingers gently over the boy's back. Then he looked up once more. "You think this ends here?" he said, his voice colder than it had been all night. "You're wrong. Sometimes defiance is the only currency left." The videos vanished almost as quickly as they were uploaded. Adrian Kessler stood frozen in his apartment study, one hand gripping the back of his chair, the other clutching his phone tightly as he refreshed the social media feeds again and again. Nothing. The clip uploaded by the young man 2 rows behind him, gone. The elderly businessman's version, flagged and removed. A blogger's reshare, shadowed under a flood of irrelevant, trending content. All evidence that Mason Drexler had strapped down a child and assaulted a passenger was evaporating before his eyes. His jaw clenched. This wasn't coincidence. This was deliberate. Adrian tapped through his inbox, eyes scanning frantically, searching for anything that might have escaped the purge. Around him, the city buzzed faintly through the windows, a low thrum of life that didn't care what had happened in the sky days earlier. The hum of injustice felt louder than the noise of the world outside. The smell of antiseptic from Jonah's wrist cream still lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the red marks that hadn't yet faded. Suddenly, his screen pinged. Encrypted file received. From Victor Hall. Adrian's breath hitched. He opened the email. Victor's message was brief. "Just in case. Use this wisely. They tried deleting mine too, but I kept a backup. Stay sharp." Attached was the full recording. Clean angle, steady hands, no blur, no sound issues. Mason's actions, word for word. The moment he pulled the oxygen mask, the smugness on his face, Jonah's wails rising. Crystal clear. The punch. The chaos. The passenger reactions. All of it, raw and untouched. Adrian slumped into his leather chair, heart pounding. Relief mixed with fury. His hands trembled, not from fear, but from restraint. The system had tried to erase the truth, but it hadn't counted on one man refusing to look away. He glanced over at Jonah, sleeping quietly in his bassinet across the room. The child's breaths were steady now, no longer ragged and panicked like they were on that cursed plane, but the bruises on his wrists had darkened. They told a story Adrian could not let the world forget. He transferred the file to an external drive, triple encrypted it, and slid it into a hidden drawer beneath his desk. "They're not just trying to protect Mason," he muttered aloud, voice cold with clarity. "They're protecting something bigger. And that means this won't stop with one video." His phone rang. It was Everett, his attorney. Adrian answered immediately. "They're cleaning house," Everett said without preamble. "I spoke with 2 of the passengers. Their uploads were deleted within an hour. One even got a warning email about violating community guidelines. Sound familiar?" Adrian stared out the window, the city now a mess of red brake lights and flickering street lamps. "They're connected to someone. Maybe a media outlet, maybe a moderator board. But it's coordinated." Everett sighed. "This means they're scared. But it also means they're capable of rewriting the whole narrative. You need to move fast." "I have the Victor Hall footage," Adrian said. Silence hummed on the other end of the line. Then, "Good. That might be our anchor." Adrian ended the call and leaned back. His mind raced. Crestline Airways wasn't just trying to preserve its reputation, they were working to erase history itself. Every removal, every silencing effort was a message. You don't matter. Your pain doesn't matter. Your truth doesn't matter. But they were wrong. He opened a new email, this time addressed to multiple contacts, journalists, lawyers, advocates he trusted. He didn't attach the video yet. Not now. He would hold it until the moment its release would strike hardest, until every angle was lined up. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. Jonah stirred. The soft sound of the baby's cry pulled Adrian back to the present. He crossed the room and lifted his son into his arms, holding him close. Jonah's tiny fingers curled into his shirt. Adrian closed his eyes. "This fight isn't just about me anymore," he whispered to the boy in his arms. "It's about every parent who's been silenced. Every child who suffered because someone thought power made them untouchable." Jonah whimpered again, nuzzling his father's chest, trusting, unaware of the storm that still brewed beyond their walls. Adrian's resolve hardened. He would not let Crestline decide what the world remembered. The truth wasn't dead, it was waiting, and in his hands it would rise. When truth is buried, it doesn't vanish, it waits. Adrian slammed the door shut behind Everett and turned the lock. The thud echoed through the sleek marble floors of his office, bouncing off glass walls and steel beams like the aftershock of a battle just declared. He crossed the room in 3 swift strides, his movements precise, not rushed, like a man accustomed to making decisions that shifted markets. Only now every step carried the weight of a father's fury. Jonah stirred in the crib near the window, his tiny fingers twitching in sleep. The bruises on his wrists, though fading, were still visible, silent, unforgiving reminders of the cruelty he had endured. Adrian's lawyer, Everett Malden, adjusted his tie and leaned over the laptop screen. The encrypted video from Victor Hall played in sharp clarity. Each second was a punch to the gut. The twisted oxygen mask, the casual violence, the helplessness on Adrian's face before he fought back. Everett's mouth drew into a tight line as he scrubbed backward and forward through the footage, watching Mason Drexler's face shift from smugness to desperation. "This is enough to bring them to court," Everett said finally, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was calm, but Adrian could see the tension in the man's shoulders, the way his fingers tapped anxiously on the desk's edge. "But you should know, Crestline will not play fair. They'll try to smear your name, twist the story, anything to weaken you." Adrian didn't flinch. He stood near the crib, watching Jonah's chest rise and fall beneath a soft gray blanket. "Let them try," he said coldly, but the words trembled slightly at the end, more from restraint than fear. Everett exhaled, running a hand through his neatly combed hair. "This isn't like your boardroom battles. They'll come after your past, your business, maybe even your parenting. They'll make it personal. They'll make you the story instead of the system." Adrian turned slowly, his jaw clenched. "They already made it personal," he said, moving toward the desk. He tapped the laptop screen where Mason's hand gripped the mask over Jonah's wrists. "Right here." The city pulsed faintly beyond the tall windows, the lights from neighboring towers blinking like distant warnings. Adrian's office, usually a place of control and calm, felt more like a war room now, evidence files stacked neatly beside a laptop that held the one truth Crestline couldn't erase. "You know what's coming, right?" Everett's tone softened, but his eyes remained sharp. "Once we file, the press will come. They'll spin stories. You'll be dragged through every media outlet. They'll paint you as unstable. They'll say you snapped Adrian let out a breath through his nose, steady and slow. Then I'll give them stability to fear." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The quiet hum of the city below and the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock filled the space. Adrian walked to his desk and sat, fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had spent a lifetime mastering strategy, predicting competitors' moves, buying out rivals, reshaping companies with quiet precision. But this wasn't a corporate game. This was survival, and not just his own. His eyes drifted again to Jonah, now curled slightly in his sleep. The room was warm, bathed in low amber light. The child's soft breathing felt like the only truly innocent thing left in Adrian's world. Everett interrupted the silence. "We'll need statements from other passengers." "Witnesses, Backup footage. Victor's video is strong, but they'll attack the chain of custody. If they claim it's doctored—" "They already tried erasing it," Adrian snapped, standing again. His voice cracked, not from weakness but from the sheer gravity of the stakes. "They deleted everything else, but Victor encrypted it, sent it straight to me. Cressley doesn't get to bury this." "I believe you," Everett replied, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of calm. "But belief doesn't win trials. Proof does. Strategy does." Adrian walked to the window, gazing out over the city as if scanning a battlefield. He wasn't just preparing for a legal fight. He was preparing for a war of narratives, of influence, of perception, and in this war, his son's suffering was the opening salvo. "We'll move fast," Everett continued, "but prepare yourself. They may bring up Dominion, your competitors, your history with the press, anything to dirty the water." Adrian gave a dry chuckle, a sound without joy. "Let them drag my name through the dirt. If my son's cries can make the world listen, I'll walk through fire to make sure they never get ignored again." He turned back to the crib, kneeling beside it. He brushed a finger gently across Jonah's tiny hand, which reflexively curled around it. "If they want a war," Adrian murmured, his eyes locked on his sleeping son. "Then they chose the wrong man." Sometimes a father's resolve outmatches any corporation's greed. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the prosecution pressed play. The screen came alive with shaky footage. The dim cabin of Cressley Airways Flight 612 flickered into view. A baby's cries pierced the silence. Mason Drexler appeared on screen, his expression unreadable as he leaned over Adrian Kessler's row, pulling down an oxygen mask. The footage zoomed slightly, capturing Mason's hands as they looped the straps, tight, unforgiving, around the wrists of the small, squirming child. Jonah's cries became desperate, raw. Then the sharp motion, Mason's fist slamming into Adrian's jaw. The courtroom froze. The jury sat stunned, their eyes wide and unblinking. One woman placed a trembling hand over her mouth. The bailiff shifted uneasily near the judge's bench. Reporters scribbled furiously, the quiet scratch of pens on paper almost as loud as the baby's cry still echoing from the speakers. And at the center of it all, Adrian Kessler sat motionless, his gaze fixed on the screen, but his hands curled into fists on his lap. He hadn't watched the footage since that night. He had lived it, and yet watching it now, from this distance, made the pain feel new. The sound of his own groan after the punch, the way Jonah's body twisted helplessly against the seat, the gasp of a nearby passenger, it all hit harder under the weight of silence in that courtroom. He felt it in his chest, tight and unmoving. Everett Malden stood beside the monitor, facing the jury. "This," he said, his voice steady but low, "is what, mister?" Kessler endured. What his son endured. Across the courtroom, Mason sat pale and rigid. He stared at the table in front of him, his jaw clenched tight. His attorney, Gregory Trent, leaned over and whispered something in his ear. But Mason didn't respond. The footage had done something no cross-examination could. It stripped away the mask. Earlier that day, Mason had sat confidently through the defense's arguments. Trent had painted Adrian as an arrogant, aggressive CEO who snapped under pressure. They spoke of the noise, the disturbance, and a misunderstanding that escalated, terms meant to fog the jury's view. They insisted Mason had acted out of concern for safety, that Adrian had been threatening. "He's used to getting his way," Trent had said, gesturing to Adrian with a casual shrug. "On the ground and in the air." But now, with the footage filling the room, that narrative crumbled. The video ended. Silence returned. No one moved. Judge Keegan leaned forward, his brow furrowed deeply. "Does the defense wish to respond before we continue?" Gregory Trent stood, but slowly, as if unsure of his own footing. "Your Honor, we reserve the right to review the source of this footage for authenticity. We have reason to believe—" Everett raised a hand. "Objection, Your Honor." This footage was submitted to the court last week, authenticated by a digital forensic expert approved by both legal teams. The defense had ample opportunity to object. Then Judge Keegan nodded curtly. "Objection sustained. The footage is admissible." Trent sat down, lips tight, his gaze briefly flicking to Mason. The attendant's once confident posture had withered. His shoulders slumped forward and his hands fidgeted beneath the table. Adrian exhaled quietly. The weight in his chest had not lifted, but it had shifted. Now it burned with clarity. This wasn't vindication yet, but it was the beginning. He turned slightly and glanced at the jury. Most still looked stunned. A younger man in the back row adjusted his glasses with shaking fingers. One juror scribbled furiously in her notebook, nodding as she wrote. Everett walked back to the center of the courtroom, facing the jury directly. "What you just saw wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a moment of confusion. It was abuse. It was power unchecked. That man," he said, pointing to Mason, "tied a baby down and struck his father and then lied about it." He paused for a beat, letting the silence return before continuing. "This case isn't about whether someone raised their voice or whether a child was crying. It's about what happens when someone in a position of authority believes they are above consequence. Mr. Kessler wasn't just fighting to protect his child, he was fighting to protect the truth." The jury listened, their focus unbroken. Adrian could feel the shift in the air. The defense's story had lost its grip. Mason was no longer just a man in uniform. He was a man caught in the act. Judge Keegan cleared his throat. "Court will recess for 20 minutes. We'll resume with the next witness following the break." The gavel struck once. As people stood and stretched, voices rose in low, tense murmurs. Everett turned to Adrian, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "You did good," he said. Adrian nodded, but said nothing. His mind replayed Jonah's cries in the video, the sight of his son struggling, restrained by someone meant to ensure passenger safety. He looked down at his palms. They no longer trembled. In the back of the room, two men in suits, Crestline representatives, exchanged hurried whispers, their expressions tight. Adrian noticed them, and something in their manner told him this wasn't over. The airline would not fall easily. There would be more lies, more attacks, more attempts to bury the truth. But Adrian had the jury now. He had the footage, and most of all, he had a purpose bigger than revenge. As the judge stepped away from the bench, reporters scrambled to exit and send updates. Outside the courtroom, headlines were already forming. Inside, the echoes of Jonah's cries lingered, not just in the speakers, but in the hearts of every person who had witnessed them. And as Adrian sat back down, preparing for the next round, he knew the tide had turned. One truth shown was enough to unravel 1,000 lies. When the truth is shown, denial has nowhere to hide. "Digitally manipulated," Damon Hale said firmly, his voice echoing through the tense courtroom. He sat upright on the witness stand, wearing a navy blue suit that fit him too perfectly, the crisp knot of his tie almost mocking the chaos surrounding him. The defense attorney stood nearby, arms crossed smugly, as if this moment would tilt the entire trial in their favor. Adrian sat still at the plaintiff's table, but his jaw clenched. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. But the thrum in his chest pounded louder with every passing second. Damon's calm, calculated tone was dangerous, not because it was emotional, but because it was surgical. "This video, while disturbing, cannot be verified as authentic," Damon continued, gesturing casually toward the screen that had just minutes earlier shown the horrifying footage of Mason Drexler strapping down Jonah and striking Adrian across the face. "We have reason to believe this was orchestrated to damage the company's reputation." Gasps whispered through the gallery like wind through leaves. Some jurors shifted in their seats, eyebrows rising. One of them, a younger man with closely cropped hair, narrowed his eyes, not in disbelief, but in suspicion. Adrian could read it. The seed of doubt had been planted. That was Crestland's strategy. Not to fight the truth, but to flood the room with so many false versions that no one could tell what was real. Adrian's stomach turned, but his expression remained composed. Next to him, his attorney Everett Malden stood, his face calm but his fingers tapping rhythmically against his legal pad. When the defense finished, Everett rose slowly. "No further questions for Mr. Hale," the defense attorney declared. Everett stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Your Honor," he said, looking directly at the judge, "we would like to introduce additional footage into evidence." The judge glanced over her reading glasses. "Additional footage?" "Yes, Your Honor." Several other passengers recorded the same incident from different angles. These were sent to a private encrypted network shortly after the event, prior to the airline's coordinated digital takedown. The courtroom buzzed again, louder this time. Damon visibly stiffened. His hands, so confidently resting on the stand, now curled slightly, the knuckles showing white. Everett nodded to the bailiff, who walked over with a new USB drive. A moment later, the monitor flickered to life once more. The first video played, a shaky but clear view from a middle seat on the left aisle. It showed Mason gripping the oxygen mask and tying it around the baby's arms. Jonah's cries echoed again, raw and unmistakable. Then came the impact, Mason's fist connecting with Adrian's face. Before the jury could recover, the second video played. This time from a window seat. Different angle, same cruelty. The clarity left no room for interpretation. The punch, the blood, the panic in the cabin. A third video followed, then a fourth. Each one consistent, each one slicing through Crestline's defense like a scalpel. Damon's face reddened. Sweat began to form along his hairline, despite the courtroom's cool air. He shifted, licking his lips, his eyes darting toward the exit as if escape were an option. Everett's voice returned, calm but cutting. "Mr. Hale, are you suggesting that all these videos, from different passengers with no connection to each other, are also digitally manipulated?" Damon opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He blinked rapidly, eyes wide, breath shallow. For the first time, the mask of calm authority slipped. Everett didn't need to press further. The silence spoke louder than words. The jurors stared at Damon, their doubt replaced by quiet fury. Even the judge's expression hardened. Adrian exhaled, slow and steady. He looked down at the cuff of his shirt, stained faintly with the memory of blood. Then he looked at the screen, paused now on Mason's face mid-action, caught in the act. The narrative had shifted. The truth had roared back. Crestline's lies, woven so carefully, were unraveling stitch by stitch. Adrian's objective expanded in that moment. He no longer sought just a verdict or even justice for his son alone. He wanted something permanent, an imprint in the public record that could not be washed away by PR campaigns or corporate money. And now, with multiple angles, with a courtroom full of witnesses, and with Damon Hale cracking under pressure, he had what he needed. The next step wasn't just victory, it was legacy. A sharp whisper from the jury box broke the silence. "They can't lie their way out of this," one juror muttered. Adrian looked at Everett, who nodded once, then returned to his seat. The judge called for a recess, but the damage was already done. The lie, once bold, now sat in ruins under the weight of undeniable proof. When many voices echo the same truth, the lie collapses. The courtroom doors swung open and the jury filed in, faces tight with concentration. Adrian Kessler remained seated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, Jonah's soft blanket folded neatly beside him on the bench. The room was silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the rustling of reporters adjusting their cameras. Mason Drexler sat several feet away, hunched and pale, a thin line of sweat trailing down his temple. He hadn't spoken a word in 3 days. Adrian didn't care. The only voice he needed to hear now was the foreman's. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words dropped like stone into still water. Gasps erupted. Reporters scrambled. Mason's eyes blinked rapidly, his lips parting slightly as if he hadn't expected to hear it, despite the evidence against him. Adrian let out a slow, measured breath. He had prepared himself for this moment, but no preparation could account for the weight of the finality. The judge's gavel struck once, loud and commanding. "Mr. Drexler, you are hereby sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for assault and child endangerment. Crestline Airways, under the court's directive, will undergo a full-scale review of its training procedures, hiring practices, and passenger conduct protocols." A wave of murmurs spread through the room, but the judge wasn't finished. He adjusted his glasses and turned his gaze toward Adrian. "Mr. Kessler, given your role as a victim, your composure, and your ongoing efforts to seek justice not just for yourself but for others, this court appoints you as the inaugural chair of an independent oversight board. Your duty will be to oversee Crestline's implementation of these reforms and ensure no such abuse ever occurs again." A hush fell. Adrian's brows rose slightly, caught off guard. He looked toward his lawyer, Everett, who gave a slow nod of approval. The opportunity was unexpected, but not unwelcome. The man who had boarded that plane as a passenger was now being asked to shape the very rules that governed the sky. Outside the courthouse, the wind had picked up, stirring autumn leaves across the wide marble steps. Reporters lined the sidewalk, their microphones raised like weapons, their questions rapid-fire and relentless. "Mr. Kessler, do you feel vindicated? What do you say to those who doubted your story? Will you accept the oversight role? What happens next for you and your son? Adrian emerged from the heavy wooden doors, Jonah nestled calmly in his arms, one small hand clutching his father's tie. The child was healing, his wrist still bore faint marks, but the sparkle had returned to his eyes. Adrian stopped at the top of the steps, shielding Jonah from the press with one hand. The noise fell into a respectful quiet as the cameras pointed upward, the flashbulbs bathing them in light. Adrian didn't answer the questions. Instead, he raised Jonah higher, his arms steady, his voice clear. This fight was never just mine. It was for every passenger who deserves to fly without fear. The applause erupted almost instantly. Reporters stopped typing. Even some of Crestline's former representatives, now blending into the crowd, looked away in shame. The moment wasn't theatrical, it was earned. The sight of a father standing tall, holding the child he had fought so hard to protect, cut deeper than any headline could. And yet, even as the crowd cheered, Adrian's eyes scanned the horizon. He knew this wasn't over. Power didn't yield without struggle. There would be resistance, quiet sabotage, perhaps even personal attacks. But he was no longer alone. Behind him stood proof, truth, and the eyes of the world. The weight of leadership settled on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. He held Jonah closer, felt the boy's soft breath against his neck, and whispered words only his son could hear. Justice, once claimed, must always be guarded. Sometimes, the smallest cries ignite the loudest revolutions. A minute later, the tables turned. The same hose became the flight attendant's downfall. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, humiliation, and the abuse of power in everyday environments. Its purpose is to raise awareness about systemic discrimination, provoke thought about accountability, and inspire action toward dignity, justice, and equality for all.